Chapter 39. The Rich and the Poor in Heaven. There are various opinions about reception into heaven. Some are of the opinion that the poor are received and the rich are not. Some that the rich and the poor are equally received. Some that the rich can be received only by giving up their wealth and becoming like the poor. And everyone confirms his opinion from the Word. But those who make a distinction in regard to heaven between the rich and the poor do not understand the Word. In its interiors the Word is spiritual, but in the letter it is natural. Consequently, those who apprehend the Word only in accordance with its literal sense, and not according to any spiritual sense, err in many respects, especially about the rich and the poor, for example, that it is as difficult for the rich to enter into heaven as for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle, and that it is easy for the poor because they are poor, since it is said, "Blessed are the poor, for theirs is the kingdom of the heavens." But those who know anything of the spiritual sense of the word think otherwise. They know that heaven is for all who live a life of faith and love, whether rich or poor. But who are meant in the word by the rich, and who by the poor, will be told in what follows. From much conversation and living with angels, it has been granted me to know with certainty that the rich enter heaven just as easily as the poor, and that a man is not shut out of heaven on account of his wealth, nor received into heaven on account of his poverty. Both the rich and the poor are in heaven, and many of the rich in greater glory and happiness than the poor. It should be said, to begin with, that a man may acquire riches and accumulate wealth as far as opportunity is given, if it is not done by craft or fraud, that he may enjoy the delicacies of food and drink, if he does not place his life therein, that he may have a palatial dwelling in accord with his condition, have intercourse with others in like condition, frequent places of amusement, talk about the affairs of the world, and need not go about like a devotee with a sad and sorrowful countenance and drooping head, but may be joyful and cheerful. Nor need he give his goods to the poor, except so far as affection leads him. In a word, he may live outwardly precisely as a man of the world. And all this will be no obstacle to his entering heaven, provided that inwardly in himself he thinks about God as he ought, and acts sincerely and justly in respect of his neighbour. For a man is such as his affection and thought are, or such as his love and faith are. And from these all his outward acts derive their life, since acting is willing, and speaking is thinking. For he acts from the will, and speaks from the thought. So where it is said in the Word that man will be judged according to his deeds, and will be rewarded according to his works, it is meant that he will be judged and rewarded in accordance with his thought and affection, which are the source of his deeds, or which are in his deeds. For deeds are nothing apart from these, and are precisely such as these are. It is evident from this that man's external accomplishes nothing, but only his internal, which is the source of the external. For example, if a man acts honestly and does not defraud another solely because he fears the laws and the loss of reputation and thereby of honour or gain, and if that fear did not restrain him, would defraud another whenever he could, although such a man's deeds outwardly appear honest, his thought and will are fraud. And because he is inwardly dishonest and fraudulent, he has hell in himself. But he who acts honestly and does not defraud another because it is against God and against the neighbour, would have no wish to defraud another if he could. His thought and will are conscience, and he has heaven in himself. The deeds of these two appear alike in outward form, but inwardly they are entirely unlike. Since a man can live outwardly as others do, can grow rich, keep a plentiful table, dwell in an elegant house and wear fine clothing according to his condition and function, can enjoy delights and gratifications, and engage in worldly affairs for the sake of his occupation and business, and for the life both of the mind and body, provided he inwardly acknowledges the divine and wishes well to the neighbour, it is evident that to enter upon the way to heaven is not so difficult as many believe. The sole difficulty lies in being able to resist the love of self and the world, and to prevent their becoming dominant, for this is the source of all evils. That this is not so difficult as is believed is meant by these words of the Lord. Learn of me, for I am meek and lowly of heart, and ye shall find rest in your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. The Lord's yoke is easy and his burden light, because a man is led by the Lord and not by self, just to the extent that he resists the evils that flow forth from love of self and of the world, and because the Lord then resists these evils with the man and removes them. I have spoken with some after death who, while they lived in the world, renounced the world and gave themselves up to an almost solitary life, in order that by an abstraction of the thoughts from worldly things, they might have opportunity for pious meditations, believing that thus they might enter the way to heaven. But these in the other life are of a sad disposition. They despise others who are not like themselves. They are indignant that they do not have a happier lot than others, believing that they have merited it. They have no interest in others and turn away from the duties of charity by which there is conjunction with heaven. They desire heaven more than others. But when they are taken up among the angels, they induce anxieties that disturb the happiness of the angels, and in consequence they are sent away. And when sent away, they betake themselves to desert places, where they lead a life like that which they lived in the world. Man can be formed for heaven only by means of the world. In the world are the ultimate effects, in which everyone's affection must be terminated. For unless an affection puts itself forth or flows out into acts, which is done in association with many, it is suffocated to such a degree finally that man has no longer any regard for the neighbour, but only for himself. All this makes clear that a life of charity towards the neighbour, which is doing what is just and right in every work and in every employment, leads to heaven, and not a life of piety apart from charity. From this it follows that only to the extent that man is engaged in the employments of life can charity be exercised and the life of charity grow. And this is impossible to the extent that man separates himself from those employments. On this subject, I will speak now from experience. Of those who, while in the world, were employed in trade and commerce and became rich through these pursuits, there are many in heaven. But not so many of those who were in stations of honour and became rich through these offices. And for the reason that these latter, by the gains and honours that resulted from their dispensing justice and equity, and also by the lucrative and honourable positions bestowed on them, were led into loving themselves and the world, and thereby separating their thoughts and affections from heaven and turning them to themselves. For to the extent that a man loves self and the world, and looks to self and the world in everything, he alienates himself from the divine and removes himself from heaven. As to the lot of the rich in heaven, they live more splendidly than others. Some of them dwell in palaces wherein everything is resplendent as if with gold and silver. They have an abundance of all things for the uses of life, but they do not in the least set their heart on these things, but on their actual uses. Uses are clearly seen as if they were in light, but the gold and silver are seen obscurely, and comparatively as if in shade. This is because while they were in the world they loved uses, and loved gold and silver only as means and instruments. It is the uses that are thus resplendent in heaven, the good of use like gold, and the truth of use like silver. Therefore their wealth in heaven is such as their uses were in the world, and such too are their delight and happiness. Good uses are providing oneself and one's own with the necessaries of life, also desiring wealth for the sake of one's country and for the sake of one's neighbour, whom a rich man can in many ways benefit more than a poor man. These are good uses, because one is able thereby to withdraw his mind from an indolent life which is harmful, since in such a life man's thoughts run to evil because of the evil inherent in him. These uses are good to the extent that they have the divine in them, that is, to the extent that man looks to the divine and to heaven, and places his good in these, and sees in wealth only a subservient good. But the lot of the rich who have not believed in the divine and have cast out of their minds the things pertaining to heaven and the church is the opposite of this. Such are in hell, where filth, misery, and want exist. And into such things riches that are loved as an end are changed. And not only riches, but also their very uses, which are either a wish to live as they like and indulge in pleasures, and to have opportunity to give the mind more fully and freely to shameful practices, or a wish to rise above others whom they despise. Such riches and such uses, because they have nothing spiritual but only what is earthly in them, become filthy. For a spiritual purpose in riches and their uses is like a soul in the body, or like the light of heaven in moist ground. And such riches and uses become putrid as a body does without a soul, or as moist ground does without the light of heaven. Such are those whom riches have seduced and drawn away from heaven. Every man's ruling affection or love remains with him after death, nor is it rooted out to eternity, since a man's spirit is wholly what his love is. And what is an arcanum? The body of every spirit and angel is the outward form of his love, exactly corresponding to his inward form, which is the form of his animus and mind. Consequently, spirits are known as to their quality from their face, gestures, and speech. While a man is living in the world, the quality of the spirit would be known if he had not learned to counterfeit in his face, movement, and speech that which is not his own. From this it can be confirmed that man remains to eternity such as his ruling affection or love is. It has been granted me to talk with some who lived 17 centuries ago, and whose lives are well known from writings of that time. And it was found that the same love still rules them as it did then. It can also be confirmed from this that the love of riches and of uses from riches remains with everyone to eternity, and that it is exactly the same as the love acquired in the world, yet with the difference that in the case of those who devoted their riches to good uses, riches are changed in the other world into delights which are in accord with the uses performed. While in the case of those who devoted their riches to evil uses, riches are turned into mere filth, in which they then take the same delight as they did in the world in their riches devoted to evil uses. Such then take delight in filth, because filthy pleasures and shameful acts, which had been the uses to which they had devoted their riches, and also avarice, which is a love of riches without regard to use, correspond to filth. Spiritual filth is nothing else. The poor come into heaven not on account of their poverty, but because of their life. Everyone's life follows him, whether he be rich or poor. There is no peculiar mercy for one in preference to another. He who has lived well is received, while he who has not lived well is rejected. Moreover, poverty leads and draws man away from heaven just as much as wealth does. There are many among the poor who are not content with their lot, who strive after many things, and believe riches to be blessings, and when they do not gain them, are much provoked, and harbour ill thoughts about the divine providence. They also envy others the good things they possess, and are as ready as anyone to defraud others whenever they have opportunity, and to indulge in filthy pleasures. But this is not true of the poor who are content with their lot, and are careful and diligent in their work, who love labour better than idleness, and act sincerely and faithfully, and at the same time live a Christian life. I have sometimes talked with those belonging to the peasantry and common people, who, while living in the world, believed in God, and did what was just and right in their occupations. Since they had an affection for knowing truth, they inquired about charity and about faith, having heard in this world much about faith, and in the other life much about charity. They were therefore told that charity is everything that pertains to life, and faith everything that pertains to doctrine. Consequently, charity is willing and doing what is just and right in every work, and faith is thinking justly and rightly. And faith and charity are conjoined, the same as doctrine and a life in accordance with it, or the same as thought and will. And faith becomes charity when that which a man thinks justly and rightly, he also wills and does. And then they are not two, but one. This they well understood and rejoiced, saying that in the world they did not understand believing to be anything else but living. From this it can be established that the rich and the poor alike come into heaven, the one as easily as the other. The belief that the poor enter heaven easily and the rich with difficulty comes from not understanding the word where the rich and the poor are mentioned. In the word, those who have an abundance of cognitions of good and truth, thus who are within the church where the word is, are meant in the spiritual sense by the rich. While those who lack these cognitions and yet desire them, thus who are outside the church and where there is no word, are meant by the poor. The rich man, clothed in purple and fine linen and cast into hell, means the Jewish nation, which is called rich because it had the word and had an abundance of cognitions of good and truth therefrom. Garments of purple signifying cognitions of good, and garments of fine linen cognitions of truth. But the poor man, who lay at the rich man's entrance hall, and longed to be filled with the crumbs that fell from the rich man's table, and who was carried by angels into heaven, means the nations that have no cognitions of good and truth, and yet desired them. By the rich, who are called to a great supper, and excused themselves, is meant the Jewish nation. And by the poor brought in their place are meant the nations outside the church. What is meant by the rich, of whom the Lord said, "It is easier for a camel to go through a needle's eye than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of God," will also be told. By the rich there are meant the rich in both a natural sense and a spiritual sense. In the natural sense, the rich are those who have an abundance of riches and set their heart upon them. But in the spiritual sense, they are those who have an abundance of cognitions and knowledges, which are spiritual riches, and who desire by means of these to introduce themselves into the things of heaven and the church from their own intelligence. And because this is contrary to divine order, it is said to be easier for a camel to go through a needle's eye. A camel signifying the faculty of learning and knowing in a general way, and a needle's eye signifying spiritual truth. That such is the meaning of a camel and a needle's eye is not at present known, because the knowledge that teaches what is signified in the spiritual sense by the things said in the literal sense of the word has not, up to this time, been disclosed. In the single things of the word, there is a spiritual sense and also a natural sense. for immediate conjunction having ceased, the word has been written by pure correspondences of natural things with spiritual things, in order that there might be conjunction of heaven with the world, that is, a conjunction of angels with men. This makes clear who in particular are meant in the word by the rich man. That the rich in the word mean in the spiritual sense those who are in cognitions of truth and good, and riches, the cognitions themselves, which are spiritual riches, can be confirmed from various passages. Also that the poor, in the spiritual sense, signify those who do not have cognitions of good and of truth, and yet desire them. All these passages may be seen explained in accordance with the spiritual sense in Arcana Celestia.